We are now going to see more in details what to do in your environment when you have ADHD. Beyond behavioral and cognitive approaches that aim to change, as their name suggests, problematic behaviors related to ADHD, as well as dysfunctional thoughts or cognition, there are so-called biopsychosocial interventions that can be implemented relatively easily in the environment of the person suffering from ADHD. There are various interventions or environmental accommodations that can be offered to people with ADHD in their family, school, or professional environment. It is a question very rarely of modifying the environment of the subject in order to reduce the sources, which support the expression of the symptoms of the disorder. A simple example to illustrate my point, you will see this later in this module, would be to avoid putting an hyperactive child who tends to talk a lot and to get easily distracted by others at the back of the class with other friends, but rather to offer him to come and sit in front. This reduces the chances that this hyperactivity will manifest itself. We can thus find for almost each symptom of ADHD environmental accommodations to reduce the impact of symptoms daily. These accommodations are therefore relatively simple, practical, and concrete. So, why are these accommodations so important? So these accommodations are important in several ways. The first is that even if drug treatments work well and psychological approaches are relatively effective, persons with ADHD may still have few symptoms that will bother them daily. Other means must therefore be found to counteract these symptoms. So, these accommodations make it possible to adapt the environment to the needs of the person who, even if she or he is taking medication, may have residual symptoms that bother him, her in everyday life. Secondly, they help to practice the behavioral and cognitive skills taught in individual or group psychotherapeutic approaches. The person with an environment perceived as less aggressive will be able to more easily think about and put into practice the strategies that have been learned. Third, these accommodations help to communicate with those around the person about their disorder. Indeed, the accommodation, whether in the family, professional, or school context, often involve the close relatives. Relatives will thus be made aware of the difficulties of the ADHD person by the implementation of these accommodations, and will therefore be much more understandable of the person's difficulties. Finally, environmental interventions help destigmatize the disorder in the eyes of the general population. Accommodation requests are increasingly accepted in educational and professional circles and go increasingly unnoticed. This situation actively participates in the destigmatization of the disorder, so that teachers, employers are more and more used to have ADHD people in their teams. So, how do I apply for accommodation and who can apply? The accommodations will be requested by the parents for a child and by the person himself or herself if he or she is of legal age. Most schools or universities have requirements for accommodations to be provided, such as having received a diagnosis by a specialist, providing a neuropsychological assessment. Often there is a need of description of the accommodations by the specialist according to the person's difficulties, and so on. The requirements will be different from one country to another and from one institution to another. Check with the institution hosting you to see what accommodations are or are not feasible. For professional accommodation, again, it will be a question of seeing whether the company in which you work offers accommodations and asking yourself the question of how to communicate to your employer the fact that you have ADHD. But we will see this later in this module. As you've just seen, environmental accommodations are simple and practical modifications in the environment of the person suffering from ADHD in order to help him or her live with his/her difficulties. You will now see in detail what these accommodations are in the different spheres of a person's life.